Conflicts that Shaped Pharaonic Egypt, Lecture 14. Saite Renaissance, Persian Invasion, and the Coming of Alexander.
Psamtik I, the Nabu-shazibani of the Assyrians, after he had led the Assyrians on their disastrous attack on Thebes, after he had helped the Assyrians expel the 25th dynasty from Egypt, Psamtik I returned to Sais, nominally as an Assyrian vassal, but he quickly asserted dominance within the Delta and was probably in control of most of northern Egypt by 660 BCE. By 658, Psamtik had completely expelled the Assyrians and created an independent Egyptian state based at Sais, which we call the 26th dynasty, ushering in the Saite period, sometimes called the Saite Renaissance. Several factors allowed Psamtik to take control. He allied himself with Gyges of Lydia, giving himself access to Ionian and Carian mercenaries, the bronze men of the sea, as Herodotus called them, latter-day versions of those earlier heavily armed Sherdan and Teheru, who entered the armed forces of Egypt and the Hittite Empire during the New Kingdom. Additionally, by this time, Assyria was facing internal conflict and pressure from the Elamites, and was unable to commit any sizable military forces to take care of far-off, newly militant Egypt. To guard the eastern edge of the Delta, Psamtik I constructed a large fortress at Tel Defene, Daphni, and other sites in the eastern Delta and western Sinai. Archaeological evidence from these sites indicates that they were probably the garrisons of Greek mercenaries. Probably late in the reign of Psamtik I, the trading city of Naucratis was founded in the central Delta, a site that would become a center for Greek settlers and Greek trade in Egypt. From 656 BCE, Psamtik also gained control of Upper Egypt, which was at that time still dating documents to the reign of the absentee pharaoh Tanwatamani. Psamtik does this not through conquest, but by a skillful diplomacy. To secure their own rule over Thebes and Upper Egypt, the Nubian pharaohs had resurrected the old office of the god's wife of Amun, a virgin high priestess, as she's sometimes called, as reported in the famous adoption stela. Psamtik I had his daughter Nitocris adopted by the god's wife Shepenwepet II, and her already adopted successor Amenertis II, both of whom were daughters of Nubian pharaohs. That way, Nitocris would eventually become the next god's wife of Amun. Psamtik I's success in Upper Egypt was also due to the cooperation of the mayor of Thebes, Mentuemhat, who was at this point the de facto ruler of Upper Egypt during the transition between the 25th and 26th dynasties. This Saite period was also a time of prolific temple construction, especially during the prosperous and peaceful reign of Psamtik I. Almost all the major monuments of the 26th dynasty were built in the Delta, however, where very few archaeological sites have remained intact, in contrast to Upper Egypt. Between 627 and 623, Assyria was in conflict with Babylon. As one might expect, following up the old idea of creating a buffer state, a weaker third party that only with the assistance of Egypt could oppose another strong state, the Egyptians allied themselves, quite remarkably, with the Assyrians. In 616, Psamtik I actually fought against the Babylonians alongside his former friends, the Assyrians, driving the Babylonians down to the Middle Euphrates. This is almost certainly an example of what we saw the Egyptians do so often, supporting the weaker of two contending powers in the east to create a thorn in the side of the stronger and weaken it. In 614, Cyaxares and the Medes captured Ashur and reached an agreement with Nabopolassar, the Babylonian ruler. In 612 BCE, an allied army of Medes, Babylonians, and the wild northern Scythians swooped down on the Assyrian city of Nineveh and captured it. Sin-Sharishkun, the Assyrian ruler, committed suicide, and a rump Assyrian state is set up under Ashur-uballit II at Haran. Psamtik does not go to their aid this time, probably because crossing the Euphrates and operating near the Tigris was considered to be inviting disaster. In 610 BCE, Necho II scraped together a force from coastal garrisons and went to the aid of the Assyrians at Haran, but the opposition was too strong, and Ashur-uballit II and his forces retreated. In 609, Necho II marched on Gaza and Judah with a much larger force, on his way to try and stem the juggernaut that was rolling over the remnants of the once proud Assyrian Empire. Necho II linked up with Ashur-uballit II, and they together besieged that last, now lost redoubt of Haran. They could not take the city, but Necho II was able to set up a headquarters at Riblah in central Syria and began to integrate into the Egyptian state territories as far north as Carchemish. Until 607, the Babylonians refrained from further Western activity, and it began to look as though 26th dynasty Egypt, already having instituted a renaissance in art and architecture at home, might actually regain territories not controlled by Egypt since the high glory days of the Ramessid period. In 607, the Babylonians did attack to the west. Egypt countered in 606. In 605, Egypt routed the Babylonians, but the Babylonians routed the Egyptians again soon thereafter. In 601, Babylon attacked Egypt, but Egypt's approach is better fortified now than it was when the Assyrians approached earlier. At Migdol, approximately 8 kilometers from Pelusium, the armies of Egypt and the Babylonian Empire met. Necho won the battle and pursued the retreating Babylonians to Gaza, which the Egyptians then seized. In thanks for the Greek assistance in this victory, Necho II dedicated his armor from the battle to the temple of Apollo at Branchidae. The Babylonians appear to have suffered considerably and took 2 years to recover, suggesting they suffered an almost paralyzing loss of men and material. They did not stop, however, and on March 15th, 597 BCE, the Babylonians took Jerusalem. Necho did not appear, and in December of 596, the Elamites attacked Babylonia, with a subsequent brief rebellion at Babylon in 595. With Babylon in stasis and internal turmoil, and Syro-Palestine in a sort of limbo, Necho of the 26th dynasty focused on Mediterranean trade with the Aegean and trade with the south. He appears to have attempted to dig a canal from the Nile to the Red Sea and sent out ships to attempt the circumnavigation of Africa. He is said to have used triremes, apparently attempting to control East Mediterranean trade. In the south, he went up against the Nubians, perhaps led by their ruler An-Lamani. His successor, Psamtik II, also invaded Nubia with a combined Egyptian and Carian Greek mercenary force. The Egyptians certainly reached the area of the Third Cataract, burned the old capital of Napata, and the Nubian ruler Aspalta was forced to move the royal residence now permanently farther south to Meroe. On the return of Psamtik II's force, Some of those Carian and Greek mercenaries carved names and inscriptions on the great temple of Ramses II at Abu Simbel. The next king of the 26th dynasty, Apries, sent an army to Cyrene on the North African coast in 570 BCE in order to help the Libyan chief Adikran against Greek colonists. The force was led by a man Ahmosa, or Amasis, to use the Hellenized form we generally employ. Amasis and his force met defeat at the hands of the Greek colonists, and Amasis, sometimes called Amasis II, to distinguish him from Ahmosa, first king of the 18th dynasty, was a jovial, hard-drinking fellow, apparently, who made friends with some of the Greek mercenaries and defeated Apries with their help. In 539 BCE, the Persian Cyrus captured Babylon from Nabonidus. His son Cambyses, after dealing with some problems of succession, accepted the surrender of Phoenicia and saw Cyprus defect from King Amasis in Egypt. Just after the death of Amasis and the accession to the throne of Psamtik III, Cambyses invaded Egypt. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, the defection by some Greek mercenaries to the Persians and groups of Arab tribes helping the Persians both contributed to the defeat of the Egyptian forces. Having fought well on the Pelusiac branch, they were finally besieged and defeated at Memphis. The conquest of Egypt by Cambyses for the Persian Empire ushers in what we call the 27th dynasty, or the Persian period. Cambyses attempted to send an expedition all the way west against Carthaginian territory on the coast, but failed. His expedition against Nubia in 523 was also a fiasco, and the army he sent west out of the Thebaid to attack Siwa Oasis through the desert appears to have been swallowed up by the sands of the desert, perhaps somewhere in the vicinity of the Great Sand Sea. Legend has it that he went mad. Herodotus records he was a human monster who stabbed to death the sacred Apis bull. Curiously enough, however, we have the remains of the burials of two Apis bulls from the reign of Cambyses, one in a sarcophagus donated by Cambyses himself. A Jewish Aramaic document from the reign of Darius I does refer to Cambyses closing temples of the gods of Egypt, but this may simply be nothing more than the recording of some aura of evil, such as that influenced Herodotus, rather than any fact. Nevertheless, Cambyses remains a somewhat enigmatic and inimical figure. During the 27th dynasty, Delta rebels, ultimately of Libyan origin, set up the rival 29th dynasty. By November of 380 BCE, Nectanebo I founded the 30th dynasty and was in charge of all of Egypt, having expelled the first period of Persian rule. In the end, Persia invaded Egypt again under the third and final ruler of the 30th dynasty, Nectanebo II, who fled first to Memphis and finally into Nubia in 343 BCE. Artaxerxes III Ocus then came to the throne of Egypt as the first ruler of the 31st, second Persian dynasty, but this second period of Persian rule would not last for long. After their defeat of the Persian forces at the Battle of Issus, Alexander the Great and the Macedonian army entered Egypt as liberators. In 332, Alexander captured Pelusium. The satrap Mazakes having ordered all the gates to be opened. One of his first tasks upon entering Egypt was to go to Siwa Oasis, to the small oracle temple of Jupiter Amun at Aghurmi. This oracle was well known in the Greek world via the Cyrenians. Legend says that Perseus and Heracles visited this oracle temple as well. First heading to Paratonium on the Mediterranean coast, Alexander and a small party then headed south through the desert. During this journey, there were said to have been miraculous occurrences. 2 crows showed them the way. 2 serpents spoke to them. Alexander, meanwhile, at the oracle temple, was greeted as the son of Amun. Interestingly, by choosing to go to Siwa, to the oracle temple, Alexander shows that he, almost single-handedly, with a very small group of people simply to accompany him, certainly not enough to protect him, enters as liberator into Egypt and visits an oasis almost as a tourist, an oasis that Cambyses and his entire Persian force could not reach. Alexander may also have been indicating that he, too, had some designs on the west as well as the east. Having been proclaimed son of Amun, Alexander begins to use the ram horns of Amun on his coinage. These we can see already in New Kingdom depictions of the Ka spirit of the pharaoh. On the Mediterranean coast, just west of the edge of the delta, at the mouth of the Canopic branch of the Nile, Alexander laid out the city of Alexandria, intended to replace Tyre, which he had virtually destroyed in a siege. Laid out and built by Dinocrates on the orthogonal plan, as laid down by Hippodamus of Miletus, Alexandria in Egypt would become the greatest of the Alexandrias founded by Alexander the Great. Alexandria was inhabited principally by Macedonian and Greek citizens. Egyptians were allowed in later, but were never privileged members of the society. In spite of an image of harmony that some moderns give to Alexandria, it was throughout its history a place of occasional bloody ethnic and religious disputes and riots. Egyptian hieroglyphic inscriptions of the time refer to the site of Alexandria as Rakhed, and this appears in some studies of the Hellenistic period as the name of an Egyptian fishing village, Rakotis. In fact, the term Rakhed simply means, in ancient Egyptian, the building site. There was no earlier Egyptian fishing village at the site of Alexandria. In Upper Egypt, Alexander built at Luxor Temple. He constructed a bark shrine there for the god Amun. In keeping with his sonship, in keeping with the fact that he has been recognized as the son of Amun, he builds at the temple of Luxor because of that temple's close connection with the Ka spirit of kingship. He is, in fact, the first ruler to build very much in Egypt since the reign of Darius I. According to the famous Alexander romance, he is said to have been crowned pharaoh at Memphis. One of the most popular novels of the Greco-Roman world is the so-called Alexander romance, which recounted the deeds, both real and fanciful, of the one man who had conquered most of the known world and defeated the Persian Empire. According to the Alexander romance, Alexander the Great was not a foreign conqueror, was not simply recognized as spiritually the son of Amun, but was in fact the rightful heir of the last Egyptian pharaoh, Nectanebo II. The Alexander romance relates how Nectanebo II took the form of the god Zeus Ammon and magically transported himself to the bedchamber of the Macedonian queen Olympia. In his divine manifestation, the pharaoh as Zeus Ammon seduced the queen, and from this union issued the great conqueror Alexander. Of course, in actuality, Philip of Macedon was Alexander's father, at least as far as we can know. But the Alexander romance clearly follows earlier Egyptian royal ideology, particularly as expressed in the divine birth cycle. These texts and scenes, first recorded in the temple of Queen Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahri, were already part of the royal myth in the mid-11th dynasty, and monuments of Manchu Hotep II already hint at this idea of a divine birth. In the divine birth cycle, the god Amun appears to the queen in the guise of her husband and impregnates her with the future king of Egypt. Even during his lifetime, Alexander might possibly have encouraged such a divine birth myth, at least in Egypt, perhaps thereby giving rise to this idea that his real father was none other than the mysteriously vanished Nectanebo II. In 331 BCE, Alexander defeated Darius III at the Battle of Gaugamela. The Persian strongman was later murdered by an official during his retreat. After Alexander's death in 323 BCE, one of his generals, Ptolemy, seized the great ruler's body and traveled rapidly to Egypt to claim the riches of the provinces as his own. Ptolemy first served as satrap, local governor, to Alexander's mentally unstable half-brother Philip Aridaeus, and then Alexander IV, the conqueror's son by his Bactrian wife Roxana. Ptolemy's coronation as pharaoh, when he finally gave up the title satrap, finally took place in 305 BCE, initiating the Ptolemaic dynasty. Ptolemy I spent much of his reign fighting other Macedonian rulers who had claimed parts of Alexander's empire. 15 royal successors, ultimately, would take the name Ptolemy, most of them marrying their sisters or occasionally princesses from the neighboring Seleucid dynasty that ruled Syria-Palestine. Each of the Ptolemaic kings took on a specific epithet, such as Ptolemy I Soter, savior, and Ptolemy VI Philometor, the mother-loving. Ptolemaic kings, as well as their queens, were deified and worshipped as part of a ruler cult. Some female members of the dynasty, such as Arsinoe II, were worshipped as goddesses in their own right. The first three Ptolemies were successful in gaining a small empire, including the territory of Syria-Palestine and several Aegean islands. But Ptolemaic power outside of the Nile Valley declined rapidly after the reign of Ptolemy V, with only Cyrenaica, northern Libya, and the island of Cyprus remaining under Egyptian control. Rebellions in Upper Egypt and civil wars, such as that fought between Ptolemy VI and Ptolemy VIII, only hastened the process of internal decline. Although Alexandria functioned as a private Ptolemaic city, a showplace that was next to Egypt, but never part of Egypt, the Ptolemaic rulers increasingly found it necessary to rely on their Egyptian subjects. The Battle of Raphia in 217 BCE introduced a new element into the Ptolemaic world. In this climactic ground battle of the Fourth Syrian War, King Ptolemy IV Philopator led an Egyptian army across the north of Sinai, crossing that area in 5 days and passing through the Jiraj Pass. On the 22nd of June, Ptolemy gave battle to the Seleucid Syrian forces under Antiochus III, about 9 kilometers southwest of Raphia, where dunes protected his flank from the expectedly superior Seleucid cavalry. In the end, the Ptolemaic forces were victorious. The cavalry of the right wing of each army routed the left wing of the other. Ptolemy slipped away from his own left wing to his center, while Antiochus and the Seleucid right wing continued to pursue the retreating Egyptian left, apparently hoping to encounter Ptolemy himself. The importance of the Battle of Raphia is not so much that Egypt defeated the Seleucids, and not so much that by the Battle of Raphia the Ptolemaic dynasty recovered most of its Syrian possessions that had been annexed by Antiochus III. The real importance of the Battle of Raphia was the fact that for the first time in this battle, Egyptian troops fought in Macedonian phalanx style. The success of the native Egyptian troops fighting in phalanx style at Raphia may have contributed to the growing nationalism in Upper Egypt and ultimately to the secession of Upper Egypt later in the reign of Ptolemy IV. During the middle years of the dynasty, Rome became increasingly enmeshed in Ptolemaic affairs, to the ultimate weakening of the dynasty. In 168 BCE, the Syrian ruler Antiochus IV invaded Egypt during the Sixth Syrian War. Rome, preoccupied with Macedonian matters, left the Egyptian problem to be settled by the Achaean League and Rhodes as mediators. But when Rome learned from a mission sent from Alexandria that the fall of the city to Antiochus was imminent, she sent 3 commissioners. They waited on the island of Delos until they learned of the victory that year of the Roman maniples over the Macedonian phalanx at the Battle of Pydna, then continued on to Egypt. The leader, C. Popilius Lanus, met Antiochus and the Seleucid army on the plains outside of Alexandria, and famously drew a circle in the sand around Antiochus, saying that he must declare if he were a friend or enemy of Rome before he crossed that line. Antiochus backed down and evacuated both Egypt and Cyprus. The power and fear of Rome had become such that the very threat of anger delivered by 3 commissioners to a Syrian ruler and his army was enough to yield a retreat. At the same time, an Egyptian priest at Memphis recorded a series of prophetic dreams in which he says he foresaw the liberation of Egypt. Amongst the powerful images he evokes is that of the figure of the goddess Isis walking upon the face of the Syrian sea. Ptolemy VIII, 145 to 116 BCE, embodies the contradictions of the Ptolemaic dynasty. During his long reign, Ptolemy VIII was well loved by the Egyptian population, showering benefactions on the economically stressed population and commissioning monumental building projects throughout Egypt, including the massive temple at Edfu, which survives mostly intact to this day. Ptolemy VIII, Euergetes II, also opened the upper ranks of the administration to native Egyptians, rather than confining such powerful positions to native Greeks. Yet this great patron of the Egyptian population and the Egyptian religion was a cruel tyrant within his family and a man renowned for his gluttony, earning the nickname Fuskan, or Fatty. After the death of his brother Ptolemy VI, Ptolemy VIII married his sister-in-law, Cleopatra II, and a few years thereafter, his own niece and his wife's daughter, Cleopatra III. The bitter rivalry between the mother and daughter spouses of Ptolemy VIII ushered in a period of civil war. And to guarantee his own power base, Ptolemy VIII murdered his own son and sent the mutilated remains to the boy's mother, Cleopatra II. The decadence and brutality of the late Ptolemaic court bankrupted and destabilized the state and forced Ptolemy VIII to seek assistance from the growing Western power of Rome. Rome had already intervened in conflicts between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids as early as the reign of Ptolemy IV. The result is that the final Ptolemaic kings were little more than vassals of Rome. The final period of Ptolemaic rule began with the reign of Ptolemy XII, whose abilities as pharaoh are cast into doubt by his nickname Auletes, the flute player. His daughter, Cleopatra VII, was of a different character entirely, and according to ancient accounts, she was the first ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty to learn the Egyptian language. Through her famous or infamous liaisons with the Romans Julius Caesar and Marcus Antonius, Cleopatra tried, ultimately unsuccessfully, to gain Egypt's independence from Rome and other powers in the Mediterranean. She appears even to have schemed more grandiosely to attempt to create an Eastern empire that would rival Rome. After defeat at the naval battle of Actium in 31 BCE, Mark Antony and Cleopatra returned to Alexandria to await the inevitable invasion by the adopted son of Julius Caesar, Octavian, soon to style himself Augustus. Cleopatra's dramatic suicide and the apparent murder of her son, Ptolemy XV Caesarion, the son of Julius Caesar, cemented Octavian's victory and transformed Egypt from a sovereign state into a Roman province. Although the Roman emperors will continue to present themselves as pharaohs in the decoration of the large temples they will continue to endow down through the reign of Antoninus Pius, the history of Egypt as a Roman province is a matter for another series of lectures. Following the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, Pharaonic Egypt is in many ways liberated from the frailties of weak human leadership. She is spread far beyond her former widest borders by the Roman Empire. Ultimately, she expands globally following the conquests of Napoleon, Egypt thereby becoming a part of general human consciousness. Obelisks that once stood near each other in Egypt now straddle the Atlantic Ocean, one in London, the other in New York City. The search for equilibrium, the attempt always to interpret the fleeting terrestrial and mortal in terms of the eternal, cosmic, and divine, continue to imbue the works of the Pharaonic Egyptians, even their own mummified remains, with an almost magnetic appeal to people of all cultures.